Hi, I'm Mike Van Wampeke, a teacher at Robinson Secondary School, and today we're going to be looking at a letter sent by Lincoln to Ulysses S. Grant in the aftermath of the Vicksburg campaign. One of the most fascinating things about the relationship between Lincoln and Grant is the stark departure in Lincoln's attitude towards the general when compared to his other commanders. Though its origin is disputed, there is a wonderful anecdote of Lincoln's feelings towards Grant when the latter was criticized for his drinking habits. In this particular retelling by Julian K. Lark, the origin is placed after the Vicksburg campaign has concluded. Here, Lincoln is willing to overlook a personal flaw of a general who gets results, and the punchline of this quip rests in Lincoln's willingness to buy the same whiskey Grant drank for his other generals if they would achieve results themselves. I don't want to place too much historical accuracy into the details of this particular story, but the tale was one that was widely circulated throughout the Union during the war and reveals a lot to us about previous frustrations Lincoln had with his other generals. Lincoln does also note in other accounts, though, that all of his previous commanders had placed the responsibility of success or failure of a campaign on the president himself. But Grant was, quote, "the first general I've had. He's a general. I'm glad to find a man who can go ahead without me," unquote. Grant clearly marks a departure in the mold that Lincoln is used to dealing with in the war. And this is a sentiment that Grant himself echoes in his own memoirs after meeting the president, noting that Lincoln always wanted, quote, "someone who would take the responsibility and act," unquote. Of course, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. The letter under examination today comes several months before the two would formally meet, as Lincoln acknowledges in the opening lines of the document. The purpose of this letter is, first and foremost, to congratulate his general. Vicksburg has fallen, and the Confederacy has now been split with Union control of the Mississippi River firmly established. Lincoln states to Grant that he has done an inestimable service to the country for taking the city. Now, most Americans know at least something about Gettysburg and its importance to the war. But many historians actually place more weight on Vicksburg's significance in beginning to change Union fortunes in the war. I have two excerpts from Michael Ballard and Joan Waugh that accord great significance to the outcome in Mississippi. When Ballard states that, quote, "Grant's victory irrevocably turned the tide of the war in the Western theater in favor of the Union," and Waugh recounts Davis's recollection that it was the darkest hour of Southern political existence, it is not hard to see why Lincoln would accord such laurels to his general. Grant's victory has sent a wave of shock through the South and brings real feelings of hope to a war-weary population in the North. So we can see why Lincoln would want to reach out and congratulate his general in the aftermath of a major campaign victory. Now, had the letter ended here, it wouldn't be all that significant in understanding Lincoln's character. I'm getting to that. But apparently, Lincoln has more to say. In fact, what is so interesting about the rest of the letter is both Lincoln's attempt to understand Grant's wartime strategy and acknowledging his own shortcomings as commander-in-chief. In this letter, we see Lincoln weighing Grant's actions over the course of the campaign, in particular the Yazoo Pass expedition, the fight at Port Gibson, and Grant's decision to march northeast along the Big Black River in the aftermath of that previous battle. Now, Lincoln prefaces his mention of these specific campaigns with a general agreement of Grant's strategy. In order to successfully take Vicksburg, Grant needed to cross from his base of operations on the west bank of the Mississippi and take the bluffs east of the city. This would give Union troops the high ground, as well as the ability to cut off the Confederate army garrisoned in the city from reinforcements or escape. But in terms of how Grant got there, Lincoln differed with his general's views. In his letter, Lincoln tells Grant that, quote, "I never had any faith, except a general hope that you knew better than I, that the Yazoo Pass expedition and the like could succeed," unquote. Now, I'm not certain if Lincoln is referring to all of Grant's early attempts to cross the Mississippi, but the Yazoo Pass expedition was actually a failure. Grant was hindered by terrain obstacles and Confederate forces and cannon in all of his early attempts to cross over. But Lincoln does still reveal something striking here, a trust in his general, that Grant knew better than Lincoln in what he was doing. Lincoln's willingness to defer to Grant's strategies is a stark contrast to other correspondence we see from Lincoln earlier in the Civil War. Lincoln then references some of Grant's other decisions once Grant finally crossed the Mississippi, the taking of Grand Gulf and Grant's decision to move northeast. Lincoln, echoing the sentiments of other commanders within the Army at this time, felt that Grant should have rejoined General Banks, and that Grant's strategy to turn north and east instead was, to quote Lincoln, "a big mistake." Grant did take a huge risk by leaving his own supply lines behind. To quote William Everhart, Grant was leading the Union Army, quote, "deep in alien country behind the Confederate Army, where the line of retreat could be broken and where the alternative to victory would not only be defeat, but complete destruction, unquote. Yet Grant's decisions reveal a lot to us about why Lincoln would want to personally acknowledge the general in the aftermath of the campaign. Looking at an assessment by historian Edward Bonekemper, we see that the decision of Grant to move contrary to Lincoln's assessment was not a mistake, but rather a bold plan designed to, quote, maintain the initiative and make the enemy guess at his objectives, unquote. Similarly, Grant's goal was to, quote, stay focused on defeating, capturing, or destroying the opposing army, not simply occupying geographic positions, end quote. Both of these quotes really highlight the qualities that Grant brought to the table as a general, and are things that Lincoln so desperately wanted from his other commanders. When you look at Lincoln's relationship with McClellan, for example, it was inactivity that irked the president more than anything else. Grant had taken a huge risk, to be sure, but when the plan succeeded, the gain to Union fortunes, as we've seen, was enormous. The end of the letter contains, at its core, an acknowledgement of error. Lincoln states to Grant that, quote, you were right, and I was wrong, unquote. Lincoln's humility here is so powerful. He has revealed his own misgivings to Grant about prior points in the campaign, but acknowledges how much this one individual has done for the country in achieving victory in the West. Again, Lincoln doesn't have to say any of this to his general, but it indicates a level of trust and respect for Grant, and marks the beginnings of increased deference to this general in future endeavors. After he first heard news of the fall of Vicksburg, Lincoln is quoted as saying that Grant is my man and I am his for the rest of the war. The consequences of Grant's actions in the West would eventually lead to Grant's promotion as the commander of the Union Army, and Lincoln's promotion of him to lieutenant general, a position not held since the time of George Washington. And while this letter does not acknowledge or even hint at either of those things, it does reveal Lincoln's ability to recognize merit in a promising individual, as well as Lincoln's own recognition of his limits in understanding the particulars or goals of a campaign.